In this section, we're going to start using cascading style sheets. Now, we're going to use cascading style sheets to edit the color, size, and font that we're using for the text. But before we do that, we've got to learn a little bit about how CSS works. I've already created an XHTML document and put it here into my text editor. This way we have a good starting point for our CSS. So we've got here a header, a couple of headers, a paragraph, another paragraph, and then a third paragraph. So there's a couple of different ways to use CSS. And the most important thing to know first is where you can put the CSS code. There are 3 places, although the first one I'm going to show you, I don't recommend you actually use it. You'll probably see other developers do it, but there's only a couple of circumstances where I really think this is a good idea. So the first way is to use the style attribute of a tag. So we set style equal to, and then inside the quotes here, we're going to put the CSS code. Now the CSS code is made up of rules, and the rules generally say that some particular style is going to look some particular way. So in this case, we're going to set the color style to the color, let's go with red. I'm going to go ahead and save, and we can take a look at this in one of our browsers. Let's use Firefox this time. And there we go. So this appears in red because we've given the style equals color : red. Now we could change this to, for example, green. And let's go ahead and take a quick look again at Firefox. I'll refresh, and now it's green. Now you may be saying, well, gee, there's only so many colors that have names. Well, actually, we can also formulate the colors using either RGB style or specific HTML color style, which is done in hex. Let's do the RGB style first. Now, colors on your monitor are essentially made up of 3 colors of light in various intensities: red, green, and blue. You've probably heard of RGB colors before. So the way we can set the RG and B intensities directly is with using this, RGB, and then we set 3 values. The first value is the red, so let's set the red to 0. The second is the green, we'll set that to 0, and then we'll set the last one to 255. These intensities are between 0 and 255, 255 being the most intense. So let's see what we get there. We refresh, and we get blue. Now, the lower the color, for example, if we just did 150, we're going to get a much darker blue, a blue that's actually closer to black. So the higher these numbers go, the closer you get to white. The lower they go, the closer you get to black. Now we can start mixing some red in there. Let's mix some 75 red, and then we're going to get a purple color. If we mix some green in there, I don't know what we'll get. Let's do 40 green. And let's take a look. Probably something still close to purple. Yeah, lighter purple. Let's make that 140. And I think that's going to give us, it looks like aqua. Oops, wrong browser. And there we get aqua. So we can mix these RGBs. So that's one way to do this. Now the second way, and probably the more common way, or the third way I should say, because we could name the color white, black, aqua, blue, etc., is to use HTML colors. Now these are done in hex. They always start with a pound sign. Then the first 2 values will be red. The second 2 values will be green. The third 2 values will be blue. Now what makes this a little more complicated is when we use this system with the pound, we actually are using hexadecimal numbers. In hexadecimal numbers, we are based on 8 or 16, depending on how you look at it. So if I was to count to 16 in hex, it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F. So 0, 0 represents 0, and FF is 255 based on this. So if I do FF 0, 0, 0, 0, that's going to again give us the very intense red color. If I do 0, 0, let's do CC, that's going to give us a pretty intensive green, although not a little bit darker than if we said FF. And let's say if we mix in some blue, let's do 8 C. Let's see how that looks. There we get kind of a green-blue. We'll mix in a little red. Let's mix in an F1 that's close to red being all the way on, just a few numbers off. And now we get this kind of light peachy orange color here. So 00 to FF, you'll see these expressed all three ways, as color names, right, green, blue, black, etc., using the RGB colors in the digits 0 to 255, and you will see them expressed using hex numbers or HTML colors just like I have here. Let's take that back, let's take that down a couple of notches. Let's go with like a, let's go with B5. Let's see what that turns out. Should darken it up a little bit. Because it's kind of a green. All right, good enough. All right, so we've made the colors. We talked about HTML colors. So this is actually not the way I would do this, though, having this in the style like this. You might see this if you're doing HTML emails, because it's really the only way to do it. But really, I recommend not using this particular method of setting the actual styles. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to comment this out. Remember, we talked about comments. So let's put our ending comments here on the right side. And let's just put it back. I probably should have used copy and paste, but greatest story never told. This way, this will still be there, and you can see how it was done, but it won't be active in the browser. The browser won't read it. So if I go back here, it'll be black again. The greatest story never told. All right, so, and that should be never written. Nor I get never told. There we go. Okay, so now we're back to where we started. We just commented that line out. Now the second way, or the second place to put your CSS is in the document head. And that's actually one of the most common ways. So what we do is we put in the head a style element with the attribute value pair type equals text / CSS. And then we'll simply put our CSS rules in here. Now, since we're not directly putting this on a element down here in the body, we've got to say which element we're going to apply the CSS to. So let's say we want to apply this to any H1 tag. Now, if we had more than one H1 tag, this would affect all of the H1 tags in our document. So what I do is I use these what are called curly brackets, or sometimes called French brackets, and I use these curly or French brackets to surround all of the rules for the H1 tag. So let's set the color now, and we'll use the RGB method. Let's set the color to, let's do like a 15, 70, and 150. Now let's just make sure this is working. This should apply to the H1 tag, the greatest story never told, never written, and we get that nice blue. Now I also could apply this to the H2 tag, for where it says a story about life, love, and computer programming, and set that to a specific color as well. So let's set this to color RGB, and we'll set this to 10, 50, 100. Now notice at the end of each rule, I put a semicolon. So now we've got a slightly different blue. It might be hard to see a slightly different blue here. I didn't go very far off what I did before, but we have a slightly different blue. Now, if I do the P tag here, let's say I want all that text to be blue as well, but I want to use a really dark blue. Then I'm going to simply say the P. Now, this is going to affect all of the P tags. So we have, it looks like 3 sets of P tags, 3 P elements in here. So RGB. 0, 0. Let's do 185. That should give us a nice dark blue for the text down here. There we go. So we have 3 different color blues. I guess I'm just feeling a little blue. I don't know. So that's how we set the color. Now on any of these elements, we also can set the font and the font size. Let's say for our primary font, we want to use Arial. So then we're going to use the font family rule, and here we can set specific fonts or font families. So let's set Arial. Now, it's always a good idea to have a backup in case someone doesn't have Arial on their machine. We'd say our second choice would be Verdana. And if they don't have that, we'll use any sans serif font. That means a font without the little tails. So now if we take a look at this, there we've got our Arial font. Now the font size is set roughly the same way, font size, but now we've got to give it a value and then we got to tell it how we're measuring. So normally we measure fonts in points. So if I say 10 points like this, now we get a 10-point font. Now I can make the fonts very, very small. I could do like 1 point here. That's not going to be readable, but it's possible. See that right there? That's the 1-point font. That's kind of ridiculous. Now, sometimes people measure the font in pixels, not points. I don't do it this way, but I've seen it done this way. And here, this is a 10-pixel font, so it's about the size of 10 pixels. I don't like doing that, but I like using what are called EMs. Now, EMs are based on the user's default style sheet. And the reason I use EMs is, let's say the user is visually impaired and has their text unusually large for the purpose of them reading it. Well, the reason we use EMs is based on whatever their initial font size is. So if I say, for example, 0.85 M, that's going to be 85% of whatever is normal for the user's style sheet. So that's 0.85. If I set it to something more than 1, like 1.5, now it's going to be 1.5 times whatever's normal on the style sheet. That's way too big. Let's go with like a 0.75 for our body text. So we have very, very precise control here over our text. Let's say we want our greatest story never written, and our subtitle will be in the font Georgia. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the font family on both of these to Georgia. And if they don't have Georgia, we'll use Times or any serif font. Almost everybody has most of these fonts. What you want to do is avoid using fonts that are way out there that nobody has. You know, like, I can't even think of one, but like a font that you might buy from a font foundry. Now with CSS3, there is a way to embed and download fonts. I'm not going to cover that in this course because it's more advanced, but that is coming in the future. All right, so let's take a look. So now we're going to refresh, and we get a nice Georgia font. Let's take some control over the font size here. So let's say for the H1, we want 1.75 Ms, so about 175% of normal. And for the H2s, we want 1.25 Ms. So 1 1/4, or 125% of what is normal. All right, I like how this is coming along. So I've created my H1, my H2, and my P tag here in the CSS, and I've basically said, okay, when you encounter an H1, you're going to style it like this. When you encounter an H2, you're going to style it like this. So we've basically reset the default style sheet and said, okay, no, we want to style things the way we want to style them. Now, this also works with spans and divs. Let's say here, I'm going to create at the end of this a div, and I'm going to set this ID equals footer. Because I'm using XHTML, I'm not using HTML5 here. In HTML5, I could just use the footer tag. So here in my footer, I'm going to put copyright 2011, learn to program.tv, and I'm going to say Mark Lassoff. All right. So there's our div. Now we could take a look at this in our browser. And there's our div there at the bottom. Now our div doesn't have any styling. We don't have a P tag in there. We don't have an H2 or an H1, so we haven't defined a style. Now because this div has an ID, what we do is we take the name in the ID and we access that through the CSS. So now that's going to take anything that's in the ID footer and it's going to style it like I say here with whatever rules I say. Now with IDs, you can only use them once per page. That's the idea of an ID. You should only use it once per page. There's something else we can use multiple times that I'll show you here in a minute. All right, so I'm going to set the font family of that to Arial, Verdana, Sans Serif, and I'm going to set the font size to very small, 50 ems. Oops, 50, that's very large, 0.5 ems, so half the normal size. So that's going to allow us to take the div here, and it's set the div down here at the bottom, as you can see, with a 0.5 em. Very, very small font, and it's in that Arial font face, or font family, that we suggested here. So remember, IDs are only used once. We set the ID as the ID attribute here in the div, and then we precede it in the CSS with a pound. Let's do a class. A class is a little different than an ID, so let's do for a span, and let's say here, span class equals smaller. And we'll just surround that one word, span. And then, since it's a class, we'll repeat it again here. Span class equals smaller. All right, so there we've got the smaller and the smaller class. Now let's set the class smaller here. Now if we do a class, we precede it with a dot. So that dot represents the smaller class, and what we'll do is for the smaller class, we'll set the font size to 0.65 ems. So now, if we take a look at this, there's our smaller spans right there, where we set it to 0.65 ems. Now, you may be wondering, well, wait a minute. This is in a p tag, and for the p tag, we set the font size to 0.75 em, and then we set the smaller to 0.65 em. Well, what happens is whatever is closer to the content wins when there is a dispute or an inconsistency in the CSS. We're trying to apply two different style rules here. The paragraph style rule, which says this should be 0.75, and then a smaller, which is 0.65. And what actually happens is this is 0.65 of the 0.75. So this rule is applied secondarily and makes the text smaller. All right, so we've looked at a couple of different ways to apply the CSS. There's one more way that's truly very, very important. So I've got here all of my CSS. I've got it in the style element. But let's say we wanted to use a CSS on multiple pages. Most websites, for consistency, use their CSS on multiple pages. So what we're going to do is we're going to link to the CSS in a separate document. So I'm going to create a brand new document here. File, new, and we'll call this, so we'll just do new file. And I'm going to save this as some file name .css. So there's our CSS intro.html. So I'll call this intro.css. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the CSS out of here using cut, and I'm going to paste it into here. Now notice I didn't take the style tags with me, just the CSS itself. Save that as intro.css. I'm going to get rid of the style tags. And what I'm going to put in here is a link tag to link to that external CSS. So the way we do it is rel equals style sheet. That's the relationship to what's being linked. Then we have the type, which is still text/CSS, just like in the embedded style sheet where we use the style tag. And now the last thing we need is the href, which is the name and location of that file. Since it's in the same folder, we can just do intro.css. And we'll shortcut close that just like that. All right, so we've linked to intro.css. Here's intro.css, which has got everything that we need. Now, if I do this in the browser, should stay exactly the same. If I make a change here to the attached CSS document, that change will be reflected in this particular document. Let's change this to 2M. So the attached style sheet is the most common and I think the most useful because oftentimes you might have multiple pages linking to the style sheet and it's going to help you keep consistency throughout your website.